I wanted to start the brief history of advertising by opening up with a way that you can understand how I'm going about it. In this module, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about advertising not only as how it's done, but also why it's done the way it's done. So in terms of digital art, a lot of the strategies that get used in digital communication, be it design, web design, even as simple as brochure making or printing from, say, a place like Modern Postcard or something like that, they all rely upon the notion that the world operates through representations. Representations are stand-ins for meaning. And part of the module before this, Visual Fluencies, had us look at what types of conventions are used in that visually representative way that we operate in a culture. In other words, if you think about it, we operate more trustingly with our representations of ourselves than the true words that come out of our mouth. So, for example, think about your driver's license. Think about your ID. Think about your PIN code that goes to your ATM card. There's a lot of stuff that we rely on a day-to-day basis that necessitates that we have an accurate, believable representation of something, right? Either the truth about who we are, or the verification that we have enough funds to put gas in our car and all that kind of stuff. And I want to make the argument to you guys in this lecture that we live in a culture that relies mostly upon representations of truth and of verification, and that we tend to put a lot of stake in those representations and certain types of representations. One of the arguments I want to make to you is that part of digital art is, what's important about it is to remember that digital art is really an art of replication. And it's an art of manipulation. It's an art of sort of like hyper-tuned representation, okay? This quote right here is from an artist and a thinker named Guy Debord. And what I've done in this talk is I've tried to, or at least in this module, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to go at this. I'm going to show you my cards and kind of go at this in a way that you understand why I'm showing you what I'm showing you. And so advertising in general has been approached both critically, analytically, theoretically in two camps that I have recognized over my time. One of the camps has to do with why advertising exists in the first place and what motivates it to make the choices that it does. The second group of thinkers looks at how advertising does those very things. And that has to do with stylistic choices. It has to do with trends. And it also has to do with changing paradigms of how the kind of capitalist engine that drives advertising in the first place, how those engines can manipulate and also change the way that we think about ourselves since we live through the sort of abstraction of representation. In this quote, in societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was once directly lived has moved away into a representation. I'm wondering what you guys think about this quote. You guys can look up Guy Debord if you want to know about his politics. But one of the things that's present here is Guy Debord is an artist and a thinker who was really after why does advertising, why do forms of representation dominate us so much, and what kinds of systems provide the justification for those representations. So, for example, one of the arguments I'm going to make to you, since digital art is largely art of a database and storytelling and recasting of images or representations, one of my assertions in this lecture and in the entire class is that rather than teach you the hows of how to work in digital art, which I'm also kind of doing, I want to really give you tools that are transferable beyond the changing and ever-changing applications that you might use to create those representations. And so what I did is I looked at how do we make sense of the world in a two-dimensional representational form, because ultimately the computer is a two-dimensional form, whether you're looking at a movie, whether you're looking at images or reading a newspaper or newsfeed. And that the power of representation is not in your ability to create that representation, but in your ability to use those skills at the service of something else and understanding the landscape or the territory within which that something else is important to you and how you can communicate it. So one of the things that Guy Debord is mentioning here is he's tacitly saying in societies where modern conditions of production prevail that somehow there might have been a time when systems of production and conditions of production, mass production, didn't prevail, and that all of life was more or less lived in kind of this mythical direct communication. We raised our own chickens and all that kind of junk. And what he's arguing is that when the conditions of production prevail, which means the capitalist engine of producing products, what ends up happening is you have a shortage of customers. And so in order to draw customers into purchasing your items or giving your money to another person, let's put it like that, I'm thinking about subscription services here. What ends up happening is that kind of fishing for people becomes way more important than the actual production of stuff. And so what happens is there becomes what he calls an accumulation of the spectacle, where all of modern life shines and sparkles and tries to get your attention. And he also is making the kind of big jump that says that somehow that process, the process of going to the mall and sort of taking all that kind of stuff in, or searching on the web for something, that's not living. That there is something called authentic, directly lived life, and then there's the representation of a directly lived life. And I just wanted you guys to think about that, because what we're focusing on here in this class is trying to learn about the mechanics of representation and why those mechanics of representation exist or need to exist in the first place. Now, what I've done here is I've gone through the social communication and advertising, and I've kind of narrowed it down with some examples so you guys can understand. In the social communication for advertising, this is a how advertising does what it does, and a little bit about the why. It doesn't go into too much economics or any of that kind of stuff, but I thought I would kind of paint a historical picture for you, which will hopefully help you make some choices when you post your ad example on our discussion forum. Okay, so there's two of the readings I'm going to cover in this lecture, and I'll probably split it into two parts so it'll be more digestible. The first part is the social communication and advertising, and then the second part will be hidden persuasion, which I also provided for you guys samples of in the Canvas page. So in social communication for advertising, what they do is they're starting to kind of generalize some of the phases of advertising that have kind of retrospectively been observed, right? This was not necessarily in a sort of planned out situation, but it was a situation that arose from the kind of contemporaneously with whatever was going on there, right? So however people were thinking. Now, in the 1860s, in the newspapers didn't exist like they exist now. A lot of times what you would have is you would just have a simple poster or a broadside of some kind that would go up in the public, and people would go and read the news. And the elements of selling early on were mainly text. It didn't really have anything to do with images. And part of the reason it didn't have to do as much with images was because of page space. And a person could make more money if they could fit more paid text advertisements on the page. And so in this case, the product is the center of attention, right? So we're looking at commodities here. and the focus of all the elements of the ad when it comes to text. And so, and one of the things that is assumed in this time period is that people are rational. They're going to make decisions based upon their pocketbook, their availability, and all that kind of stuff, ease of use. And so the ads were usually heavy with text, right? Included some illustrations if it was allowed by the printer. And again, it was a very rational strategy, laying out for you why your soap is better than somebody else's soap. And it's very just matter of fact. Okay, they weren't trying to get you to be a part of their brand or convince other people to go out and use the soap you're using. It was just sort of treating them as though they were just sort of like a part of life. They weren't really anything special. Okay. And so I'm just going to show you some examples. This is like a very text-heavy ad. Sometimes they bordered on kind of like, is that really an ad? So you can see here, this is a very early 1920s ad for Ford. Now sometimes you see automotive or automobile ads and there's only a car. Okay. Shirts for sale. They also have gloves, half hose, and so on. When there were illustrations, sometimes they just didn't really link into what was being sold. And keep in mind, this is a very different time from 2022. And this is more of a receipt. I also wanted to bring in the fact that the world was very divided. There was not equality. So advertising, old advertising, actually reflects that kind of racial divide in the country, because the slaves were still slaves in that time in the late 1800s. Although freed from the Emancipation Proclamation, they still were, and this is earlier, they were still treated as though they were property. And so that's represented in a lot of the advertising. Another early ad where it's primarily text, and then there's just something sort of, so the hydraulic, this is the brake lining. How do you sell brake lining? Well, you don't, this is kind of interesting because the car is going fast, and so if you're going to have your brake lining must not fail, therefore if you want to go fast, use these brakes. Very straightforward. The second phase of advertising that has been noticed, again retrospectively, is the form, what's called product and image forms. And this is from like the late 20s through the end of, say, World War II. And by the way, these are not strict dates, like all of a sudden, 1920, everything shifted. It's not true. But some of the techniques that have been observed are that the brand of and by the way, what's interesting about the brand is that early on, the brand of an object or say like a potato or whatever, or a bar of soap, sometimes these would come in boxes, and usually the boxes were made of wood, and they would brand, like physically hot brand, the name of the product onto the barrel, and then all the product would be inside. You just pick one. And so this kind of carries over, and the brand of the product is important. So in other words, who did it is very important. But what ends up happening now is that advertisers are starting to attribute special qualities to the project through a symbolic relationship of the project to a setting, and that's a representational choice, right? So you might have, I'll show you some examples, you might have some things that were on a table, and the setting of the table will give you a clue about what types of people use this object. The focal point here swings away from the object as an independent entity and toward the person or potential user of the product. And this is more of an abstract phase in advertising because it left the reader to fill in the gaps sort of intellectually and visually as to what the relationship between the object or the commodity and the setting was. And this was usually pretty easy to understand. So one of the early observations of advertising criticisms is that advertising had a two-part role. It had to teach us how to read the advertisements by kind of spelling it out really slowly, right? And then it also had to sell goods. This phase relied heavily upon narrative techniques like metaphors, allusions, allegory, or a story, or a simple juxtaposition, which means just something that's next to it, next to another thing, to kind of associate that thing with whatever associations we have with that thing it's juxtaposed with, and to try to expand the symbolic dimensions of that representation. In this ad, this is a part of a two, I think it's like a 2-page, what they call a double truck ad. And you can see in this image that, in fact, they're selling a car, but what they're selling it through is through what was then a very exclusive and very expensive object, a TV. And also, you can notice that on this woman is wearing pearls, she has a pearl ring, so there are all these little cues about what types of people would purchase this GM car, the luxury cars of that day. This again is another partial image, but again you can see, look, these people are happy, and you can notice that the images are starting to dominate the screen, or rather the page space. And so what ends up happening is that stories start being told through imagery as opposed to through text. And what we first see is we see the image on these early ads, and we end up starting to develop an associative relationship with the thing that's being sold and the situation that's being represented in the ad. And sometimes they were just very beautiful design pieces. This is an older version, but again, images are starting to creep in a little bit. A lot of ponds. It's always fun to look at images of the future from the past. But compared to earlier ads, this ad is practically 2/3 image. All right. After World War II, the United States was in a fairly good economic position, and this was a time when a lot of production stopped from 1941 to 1945 of new automobiles and luxury items, because most of the gross domestic product went to the support of World War II. So in post-World War II, there is this hunger for companies to get back on track in terms of selling and creating their products. And this is where they have a problem that increasingly develops, which is that they have created more stuff than there are people to buy the stuff. And what they had to do was create strategies that would get people to purchase these items. And how do you communicate that strategy? Well, you can use it. You can use psychology. You can use visual kind of visual dynamic things that are or subjects that are related to a particular lifestyle that you might want to be a part of. And this phase is known directly for its relationship between the product and the human personality as a defining framework of the ad. In these ads, people are explicitly interpreted within their relationship to the world of the commodity. Social admiration, pride in owning it, anxiety about not having it or using it, or the satisfaction gained in using it became important dimensions of ownership. It is based on the idea that we decide how to relate socially to one another based first on our ability to identify similarities and differences through visible cues. The commodities operate as extensions of this sign system. The previously separate worlds of people and products become merged. I am what I wear. And in this phase, the scenario depicted, or the models depicting it, become the products. So in a way, the person in the ad stands for the product rather than standing behind its quality or exemplifying the types of people that use this product. To say the least, there is some reiteration of social norms which are questionable. Also, you're starting to get a direct address from the viewer, as though you're a part of the situation. So you'll see that the product here, what's different about the product is it's not just that people are there or a certain type of person is representing the product by standing next to it, or the type of person that uses that product can be implied by the kind of accoutrements of the area that the thing is on, like the Pond's cream. In this case, what you're doing is you're seeing people living within the reality of using this product. And so the product is starting to take a back seat to the way that people interact with the product. And so what they're selling here is they're selling a type of possibility that you could be like. And that, by the way, Coca-Cola, in this case, is a great accessory for that lifestyle. And so once you achieve that, you're going to need some props. And among the props you're going to need are Coca-Cola. All right, now phase 4, the commodity as symbol of lifestyle. So you can see that the boundaries between or among these different phases are kind of blurry, and that's intentional. But these are kind of, but again, these are just general descriptions of that era, and it gets more subtle. Some of the dominant techniques seen in this phase are the phase could be described as a combination of the last two phases. It's a merging on any number of levels of the commodity, the image of the commodity, and the as a person forms. So this form relies on stereotypes of social interactions, right, as signs of one's affiliation with or relationship to a group or a social context. The act of consumption is usually behind the scenes, and we saw a little bit of that in the last slide with the Coca-Cola ads, and it links consumptions to appropriate settings and situations rather than on satisfaction. And it's not merely enough to consume this or that product, you might also consider the way that you do so. Usually these ways or their lifestyles are depicted for us so that we can insert ourselves into the scene. Consumption therefore takes on a new role. It indicates our desire to be associated with certain lifestyles through commodities, like commodities as props. These ads can also convey this relationship by situating the commodity directly in an activity that indicates a certain slice of life in that lifestyle. Could be romantic, fun, athletic, and so on. And at the same time, it can allude to a certain type of person who would naturally use those things. And so if you wanted to be that type of person, naturally, you need the right props. And in the commodity lifestyle phase of the advertising, the dimension of consumption that provides the unifying framework of interpretation is action or behavior, right? So the primary thing that's being represented is what are people doing with that thing? What kinds of social groups or situations, rather than just the use, satisfaction, or utility of the object is going on. And these are usually linked with the advent of televisions and narrative power. So it's a combination of not just the limitations, say, of print, but the expansive possibilities of time-based medium, such as soap operas and that kind of thing. And again, here's another cliche of social norms. These are quite old ads. This ad, by the way, Madge was I remember seeing this as a kid. Madge was a manicurist, and the presumption is that all women wash dishes, and therefore, if you have dishwasher hands, you go to the manicurist, and the manicurist is like, "Oh my goodness, you've been washing too many dishes. We've got to fix this." And so, the solution to the problem is to wash more dishes using Palmolive. And this is just bizarre. High karate, somehow putting putting your potential mate in a kind of a chokehold. It's just, again, more of the social cliches. Now, in the logosphere, this is where things really change. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to split this up, and we'll start on part 2 of the logosphere next.